The Battle of Songgufeng by Unit 335. After the 3rd Platoon climbed up the hill, they hadn't had a chance to construct any fortifications when they spotted a large group of American soldiers approaching. Leading the Chinese Volunteer Army's front line was the 8th Squad, lying prone only about 20 meters away from the approaching Americans. As soon as they saw the Americans, Yang Wenming, the machine gunner of the 8th Squad, opened fire first, immediately setting the first vehicle on fire. Following him, platoon leader Wang Jianho and 5 other soldiers charged onto the road, launching rocket attacks at the American tanks. Meanwhile, the rest of the squad hurled bundles of grenades into the enemy convoy. At the same time, the demolition team from the 5th Squad rushed out and blew up the 2nd American tank. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. The American forces, caught off guard, were in chaos. The road was completely blocked, but the U.S. 2nd Division was composed of elite troops. After a brief moment of confusion, they regained their composure and immediately launched an attack on Songgufeng. They knew that if they wanted to survive, they had to break through Songgufeng. This marked the beginning of one of the most brutal battles in the Korean War. Once the battle started, Fan Tianen realized that there was no time to construct fortifications on the position. Fearing heavy casualties among his soldiers, he started using a radio to communicate with the 1st Battalion, but it seemed that their radio had been compromised, and the messages coming through were all in English. The American commander on the other side was in the midst of a heated argument and even using profanities. When Colonel Fan saw that he couldn't reach the 1st Battalion, he immediately ordered the 2nd Battalion to provide machine gun support to the 1st Battalion's 3rd Company. At this point, the 1st Battalion commander was becoming increasingly anxious. The 3rd Company was positioned right next to the road, and there were no bunkers for cover. He quickly ordered the 1st Company on the left and the 2nd Company on the right of the 3rd Company to fix bayonets. In just a short while, the American forces launched nearly 3 charges. Their aircraft flew dangerously low, dropping bombs and incendiary devices perilously close to our soldiers' positions. The American artillery was aware that if the breakout attempt failed, they would all die right there, so the entire U.S. 2nd Division relentlessly pressed their attacks. Projectiles rained down on the position like a storm, with shrapnel flying all around, and the battlefield ablaze. After the artillery barrage, the Americans began their assault. Battalion Commander Wang Suchi immediately ordered the 1st Company on the left to launch a flank attack, engaging the enemy in close combat. The American artillery fire hadn't ceased, but the 1st Company fought with bayonets and drove the Americans down. Seeing that the situation was untenable, the Americans attempted to attack from the right but were met by the 2nd Company, also armed with bayonets, who pushed them back. The casualties among these 3 companies were extremely high, and the American forces continued to increase exponentially. This was just one division, even though it was a depleted one. Division Commander Yang Dai stood on the hill at the command post, gazing into the distance in the direction of the 3rd Company. Along the several kilometers of the road, all he could see were American vehicles and tanks, seemingly endless. The 4th American assault came at the height of the fierce firefight on our position. They charged up and reached the 4th Squad's position. Our soldiers were shouting for the machine gun, but by this time, the machine gun barrel had been warped by the intense heat caused by the fires. Just think about how many incendiary rounds the Americans must have used. Machine gunner Li Yuman ran up to the fallen soldiers' bodies and grabbed a rifle before charging forward. After just a few steps, his thigh was pierced by a bullet, but do you know how he stopped the bleeding? He inserted a bullet directly into the wound and then lifted his bayonet to continue fighting. Other soldiers from the 4th Squad also rushed in at this point, and the Americans were truly scared. They turned and fled. Meanwhile, the 3rd Platoon leader had been blinded by a shell explosion, but he crawled over to pull Li Yuman away. Li Yuman shouted, "You go, command, the enemy is about to shell us again." At the same time, our forces were also closing in on the Americans from all directions. This was when General Yang called on the phone, clearly furious because according to intelligence, 4 American military vehicles had passed through Unit 335's defensive zone and escaped. On the phone, General Yang shouted, "You bring them back to me. Remember, not a single American should get away heading south." During the Americans' 5th assault, which occurred when the fires were at their most intense, they managed to advance up to the position held by the 4th Squad. Our soldiers kept shouting for the machine gun, but by then, the machine gun barrel had been warped due to the intense heat caused by the fires. One can only imagine how many incendiary rounds the Americans had used. Machine gunner Li Yuman rushed towards the enemy, even though he had been shot in the thigh just a few steps away. But do you know how he stopped the bleeding? He inserted a bullet directly into his wound and then lifted his bayonet to continue the fight. Other soldiers from the 4th Squad also charged in, and the Americans were truly scared. They turned and fled. By noon, Unit 335 had destroyed the 4 American artillery vehicles they had been chasing for a day. At this point, the 3rd Company on Songgufeng was left with less than half of its soldiers. Company Commander Dai Rui and Instructor Yang Xiaoqing burned all their notes and documents. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Americans launched their 5th assault. The Chinese Volunteer Army's encirclement was nearly complete, and the American forces were now desperate. They knew that if they couldn't break through, it was all over for them. The battle to capture Songgufeng had involved over 1,000 soldiers, with aircraft, artillery, and dozens of tanks and vehicles. They took turns bombarding the Volunteer Army's position. There were no fortifications, the soldiers took cover in shell craters. The American forces committed more and more troops to the attack, while the Volunteer Army's soldiers dwindled. Platoon leaders were gone, squad leaders took charge, and even cooks and communication personnel joined the fight. Instructor Yang Xiaoqing ran out of bullets, picked up a martyr's bayonet, and charged at the enemy. An American soldier grabbed his waist, but Yang Xiaoqing pulled out his last grenade and smashed it into the enemy's head, detonating it, and taking down 6 or 7 foes. Wounded soldier Zhang Xuerong, badly injured, picked up 4 grenades left behind by a martyr and rushed into the midst of the enemy. Soldier Xing Yutong, engulfed in flames from an incendiary device, charged into the enemy with an American soldier, burning both to charred remains. The soldiers' bayonets were broken and battered, and they resorted to biting and using their fists. Even when they were on the brink of death, they would detonate grenades, taking the enemy down with them. The 5th American assault failed, and the 3rd Company on Songgufeng was left with just 7 soldiers. The battlefield had turned into a wasteland, with hundreds of American and martyrs' bodies. Even the soldiers' firearms had been shattered. All the martyrs remained in the positions they held before their sacrifice. Some had grenades covered in American brain matter, and some even had American ears in their mouths. Xing Yutong's body was still emitting smoke, and his hand had penetrated into an American's body. This was the most heroic battle in the Korean War. A single company fought from 6 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. The 3rd Company started with 120 soldiers and ended up with only 7. They had defeated over 600 enemy soldiers, with a kill-to-loss ratio of 6 to 1, successfully completing their blocking mission. The main force of the American 25th Division and the South Korean 1st Division was blocked, and the American 2nd Division was reduced to less than 20% of its original strength. The American 25th Division and most of the South Korean 1st Division were annihilated. Upon seeing the battle report, General Peng Dehuai was greatly moved and added a sentence to his commendation telegram: "Long live the Chinese People's Volunteer Army! Long live the 38th Army!"